Look at the data. Comet Atlas is an extinction-level event. Your silence guarantees the destruction of both our species. We need your guidance
Fluorescent lights in
now.
Quarter 7B never flickered. That's what I remember most clearly. The absolute surgical consistency of that blue-white hum stretching into concrete infinity. No shadows, no variation, just sterile brightness and the distant whisper of recycled air pushing through vents that had been filtering the same desert heat for 70 years. My name is Noah Oliver. I was 34 years old when they gave me level 6 clearance for Project Winterlight. Linguist by training, psychological operations, consultant by necessity, and, according to the file that arrived in a locked titanium case, the last person who would ever speak with Subject Epsilon 7. The last living extraterrestrial in United States custody. They didn't tell me it was dying. That came later, in the redacted medical reports I found buried in subsection files. They told me I had 6 weeks to complete a comprehensive linguistic and cognitive assessment before asset decommissioning. Military language for letting something ancient and irreplaceable slip away into silence. The briefing took 4 hours in a room with no windows. Colonel Sarah Vance, iron gray hair, eyes that had seen too many things go wrong, laid out the parameters with surgical precision. No recording devices, no written notes leaving the facility. No discussion with anyone lacking Winterlight clearance, and under no circumstances was I to ask about the message. What message? I asked. She closed the folder. If it chooses to tell you, Dr. Oliver, then you'll know. If it doesn't, then the question answers itself. I signed documents that could put me in federal prison for the rest of my life. I submitted to medical screenings, psychological evaluation, and a polygraph test that lasted 3 hours. They needed to know I could be trusted. What they really needed to know was whether I could handle the truth without breaking. The facility exists in layers: surface level, radar testing, aerospace development, the official narrative; sublevel 1, advanced propulsion systems, recovered technology, plausible deniability; sublevel 2, biological containment, where the real work happens in rooms that don't appear on any blueprint. I took the elevator down for the first time on a Tuesday morning in March. The desert above was already hitting 90 degrees. Down here, the air was 68 exactly. Humidity controlled, everything measured and sterile and wrong. The doors opened to Containment Wing C, and somewhere in the silence ahead, something that had traveled between stars was waiting to speak. The first week was protocol. They didn't let me near the entity. They called it the subject, always lowercase, always clinical, until I'd absorbed 6 decades of observational data. Film reels from the 1960s showing a being in obvious pain, trying to communicate through gesture and sound. Digital recordings from the 90s, clearer but somehow more disturbing. The subject sitting motionless for hours, occasionally turning its head toward the observation window, as if it could see through the one-way glass into the souls of the watchers. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the xenobiologist who'd been studying Epsilon 7 for 12 years, gave me the practical briefing over coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through metal. It understands English perfectly, she said, her voice carrying that particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent too long with impossible truths. Probably a dozen other languages, too. It learns by, I don't know, absorption, observation. It watched television for 2 years in the 80s, read every book we gave it, stopped asking for more around 2003. Why? She stirred her coffee without drinking. We think it decided humans weren't worth the effort anymore, or maybe it just got tired. It's been here since 1947, Noah. That's 78 years in a concrete box. 78 years of being examined, tested, questioned, and never once allowed to see the sky it fell from. The entity's biology was failing. The report spelled it out in clinical detail. Progressive cellular degradation, incompatible atmospheric composition, something the doctors called existential fatigue, a breakdown happening at the level of consciousness itself. It was dying of Earth, dying of isolation, dying of being the last of its kind in a world that had turned it into a classified asset. My job was to extract whatever knowledge remained before the asset decommissioned itself. I spent those first days in adjacent rooms, watching hours of recorded interviews through that one-way glass. Different interrogators over different decades, each convinced they'd be the one to crack the code, unlock the secrets, get the answers that would change everything. But I noticed something the analysts had missed. The entity never answered questions about technology, never explained propulsion systems or energy sources, or any of the things the military desperately wanted to know. Instead, it answered questions about philosophy, about consciousness, about why its kind had been watching Earth for millennia. In a 1983 recording, a frustrated Air Force general demanded, "What do you want from us?" The entity had tilted its head, the gesture eerily human despite the distinctly non-human physiology, and responded in that strange, layered voice, "Want is a human concept. We observe, we document, we wait to see if you will pass." "Pass what?" the general had snapped. "The test you're taking without knowing you're being tested." The recording ended there. The file noted the general had requested reassignment the following week. I watched that exchange 17 times, trying to understand. On day 8, Colonel Vance appeared in the observation room while I was reviewing files. "You've been cleared for first contact," she said. "Tomorrow morning, await 100 hours. You'll have 60 minutes. Use them wisely." What should I ask it? She looked at me with something that might have been pity. "Whatever you think matters, Dr. Oliver. Just remember, this conversation ends when one of you dies. Make it count." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my assigned quarters, sterile white walls, government-issue furniture, a single window that looked out onto the Nevada darkness, and thought about what I would say to a being that had witnessed human history from the outside, that had watched us split atoms and reach for the moon and wage endless wars over resources and ideology. What do you ask the last witness to everything we've become? The question kept me awake until the desert sun rose blood-red over the mountains, and the day I would speak with the impossible finally arrived. I showered, shaved, put on the required sterile clothing, went through decontamination, signed more documents, received final briefing from Dr. Tanaka, who looked at me with something close to warning in her eyes. "It will know you," she said. "The moment you walk in, it will understand you completely. Everything you are, everything you fear, everything you hope. That's what they do. That's how they've always observed us." "Should that frighten me?" "That's up to you," she said. "But Noah, remember it's dying. Whatever it says, it's saying because it's chosen to, not because we forced it." At 0758 hours, I stood outside the containment chamber door, heavy steel, biometric locks, warning signs in 3 languages. Beyond that door was a truth that could rewrite human understanding of our place in the cosmos, or maybe just a dying being in a concrete room, alone at the end of everything. The locks disengaged with a sound like a held breath releasing. I stepped inside, and for the first time in my life I understood what it meant to be truly seen. The chamber was larger than I expected, 20 feet by 20 feet, white walls that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Climate controlled to exact specifications. A simple chair, human-sized, positioned near the center. And in the far corner, beneath what appeared to be a modified medical monitoring system, the entity sat on a platform designed for its distinctly non-human anatomy. It was smaller than the film suggested, perhaps 4 feet tall when upright, though it currently rested in a position that seemed simultaneously relaxed and alert. The skin, if you could call it that, had a translucent quality, like frosted glass concealing depths that shifted with breath. 2 large eyes, dark and entirely black, no white, no iris division. They tracked my movement with an intelligence that sent a primal shiver down my spine, not threatening, not hostile, just aware. "Dr. Oliver," it said, and the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, layered like harmonics, like a chord rather than a single note. "You are different from the others. You came to listen, not to demand." I had prepared opening remarks, professional, clinical. They evaporated in the face of that observation. "How do you know my name?" I managed. "It is written in the electromagnetic field you generate. Every human carries their identity in the space around them. You are Noah Oliver, 34 years old. You lost your mother to cancer when you were 19. You study language because you believe communication can prevent the wars your species seems compelled to wage. You are afraid, but not of me. You are afraid of what learning the truth will cost you." I sat down in the chair, my legs suddenly unreliable. "That's accurate. I have been observing humans for longer than your civilization has possessed written language," the entity said, with something that might have been sadness. "Reading you is no more difficult than you reading the expression on another human's face." A long silence filled the space between us. I could hear my own heartbeat, the whisper of recycled air, the faint electronic hum of monitoring equipment recording everything. "They told me you have a message," I said finally, "about humanity being tested." The entity's eyes seemed to shift focus, looking through me rather than at me. Every species reaches a threshold, a moment when they possess the capability to destroy themselves or transcend their limitations. Your kind has reached that threshold. What you do now, in these next few decades, will determine whether you pass into the next stage of consciousness or collapse into extinction. "What kind of test?" I leaned forward despite myself. "Who's administering it?" "There is no administrator, no judge, no cosmic authority watching from above." The entity moved slightly, a gesture that might have been the equivalent of a shrug. "The universe itself tests species through the consequences of their own choices. We, my kind, we merely observe and document. We have done this for millions of your years, watching species rise and fall across thousands of worlds. And how many pass?" Silence. Long enough that I thought it wouldn't answer. Then, "Fewer than you would hope, more than you might fear. I thought about my briefing materials, the decades of interrogations, the frustration of military officials who wanted blueprints and weapons and concrete answers. Why won't you share your technology, your knowledge? If you've been watching us, if you want us to pass this test, why not help? Help? The entity's head tilted again. What you call help would be interference. A child learning to walk must fall many times. If you carry them forever, they never learn balance. Your species must find its own way, or the answer means nothing. Even if finding our own way means we destroy ourselves? Especially then, it said quietly. Because a species that requires external salvation is not ready for the responsibility that comes with cosmic consciousness. You must save yourselves, Noah Oliver, or you must fall. Those are the only two paths that lead to truth. Behind the one-way glass, I knew observers were recording every word, analyzing every implication. Colonel Vance would be there, Dr. Tanaka, probably a dozen others with security clearances that exceeded my comprehension. They wanted answers about propulsion systems and energy sources. They were getting philosophy. But I was beginning to understand that philosophy was the technology. Consciousness was the energy source. You're dying, I said, changing direction. Dr. Tanaka told me, your biology is failing. Yes. Simple. Matter of fact. I am the last of the observation team. The others died decades ago. We were not meant to survive in your atmosphere for this long. We were not meant to be imprisoned. The word hit like an accusation. Imprisoned? What else would you call 78 years in this room? I volunteered to stay after the incident your government calls the Roswell crash. I volunteered to be a bridge between our understanding and yours. I believe that direct contact would help your species recognize the larger context of existence. The entity's voice carried a weight of regret. I was wrong. Your leaders were too afraid. They turned communication into interrogation. They turned wonder into weaponization. And so I have waited here, watching your world through television and books and the minds of people like you who come to speak with the impossible. I felt anger rising, not at the entity, but at the decades of lost opportunity. If you could leave, if I could help you leave, would you? I cannot leave, it said simply. My biology is too degraded. The ship that brought me is disassembled in laboratories across your nation. And even if I could return to the stars, there is nowhere to return to. My civilization moved beyond this dimension of reality 12,000 years ago. I am an echo, Noah, a witness left behind to see if you would choose wisdom over destruction. And what do you see, looking at us now? The entity was silent for a long moment, those black eyes fixed on me with an intensity that seemed to penetrate every layer of defense I had ever constructed. I see a species at war with itself, it said finally, brilliant and brutal, capable of profound compassion and unspeakable cruelty. You reach for the stars while poisoning your own world. You speak of love while building weapons of extinction. You are the most paradoxical species I have observed in 300,000 years of watching. That doesn't answer my question. Doesn't it? The entity leaned forward slightly. You ask what I see. I see potential. I see the same potential that exists in every species that reaches this threshold. Whether that potential manifests as wisdom or destruction, that is the test. And the answer is being written right now in every choice your species makes. The timer on the wall showed 15 minutes had passed, 45 remaining. I had a list of prepared questions, protocols to follow, specific information the government wanted extracted. Instead, I asked, are you lonely? The question hung in the sterile air between us. For the first time since I'd entered the chamber, the entity's absolute composure seemed to crack, just slightly, like light refracting through damaged crystal. Yes, it said, and the word carried harmonics of something I couldn't quite name. Sorrow, maybe? Or recognition? Loneliness is a constant I did not anticipate when I volunteered to remain. My species does not experience isolation the way yours does. We existed in a state of constant communion, consciousness flowing between individuals like water between connected vessels. Here, in this room, I am singular, separate, alone in a way my kind was never meant to endure. I thought about 78 years in this white box, no sky, no companionship, no one who could truly understand what it was to be the last of something ancient watching something new tear itself apart with potential. The others who came before me, I said carefully. The interrogators, why did you answer their questions about philosophy but never about technology? Because they asked the wrong questions, the entity replied. They wanted to know how we built our ships, how we traversed the distances between stars, how we harnessed energies beyond your current understanding. But those are not the questions that matter. What questions matter? The entity shifted position, and I realized with a start that the movement was deliberate, designed to put us at equal eye level, an act of respect I wasn't sure any of the previous interrogators had earned. The questions that matter are these, it said. Well, why do you exist? What responsibility comes with consciousness? How do you balance individual freedom with collective survival? What will you choose when you gain the power to remake reality itself? And those are the questions of the test. Those are the questions every species must answer. Your technology will advance regardless. That is inevitable. Mathematics and physics operate the same way throughout the cosmos. Eventually, any sufficiently persistent species discovers the principles we use to cross the stars. But technology without wisdom is just sophisticated extinction. That is what we observe. That is what we document. The moment when a species either transcends its violent adolescence or destroys itself with tools it isn't mature enough to wield. I thought about nuclear weapons, climate change, artificial intelligence, all the ways we'd gained power without gaining the wisdom to use it responsibly. When does the test end? I asked. It already has. The word sent ice through my chest. What? The test is not in the future, Noah Oliver. It has been ongoing since the moment your species gained the ability to end itself. Every choice you make now, every action, every decision, individual and collective, is the answer being given. We do not grade it. We do not intervene. We simply observe whether you choose cooperation or domination, sustainability or exploitation, compassion or cruelty. And what have you observed? The entity's eyes held mine with an intensity that felt like being seen at the atomic level. I have observed both. I have watched your species land on your moon and wage genocides, build hospitals and drop bombs, create art of transcendent beauty and commit acts of unfathomable horror. You are, in every moment, choosing which version of humanity will survive. Behind the glass, I imagined Colonel Vance's growing frustration. This wasn't intelligence. This wasn't actionable data. This was philosophy being delivered by a dying being that had watched us from the outside for longer than our civilization had existed. But it was also the most important thing I'd ever heard. If you've already determined we're being tested, I said slowly, if you've been observing us, make these choices for decades. What's your assessment? Do we pass? I'm not permitted to tell you the outcome, the entity said, because knowing the outcome would change the test itself. If I told you that you pass, you might become complacent. If I told you that you fail, you might lose hope. Either way, you would stop making genuine choices. You would perform for the observers rather than acting from authentic understanding. But you must have an opinion. I have an observation, he corrected gently. Your species possesses unprecedented potential. You have developed more rapidly than almost any species we have documented. In less than 12,000 years, you went from scattered tribal communities to a globally connected technological civilization. That is remarkable. It is also dangerous, because you have gained power faster than you have gained wisdom. The entity paused, and when it spoke again, its voice carried something I hadn't heard before, something that sounded almost like hope. But you are also capable of change, of learning, of recognizing your own mistakes and choosing differently. That is rare, Noah. Many species become locked into patterns of thought that ensure their destruction. You remain fluid, adaptive. That is your greatest strength. Or our greatest weakness, I countered. If we can change that quickly, we can change in the wrong direction just as easily. Yes, the entity agreed, which is why the test continues, which is why I have spent 78 years in this room, watching through the narrow window your government allows, hoping that each generation might choose slightly more wisely than the last. I glanced at the timer. 28 minutes had passed. In the silence, I could hear my own breathing, too loud, too human. I thought about everything I'd read in the files, all the failed attempts to extract useful intelligence, all the frustration and paranoia and militarized thinking that had surrounded this being for nearly 8 decades. And then I thought about the message Colonel Vance had warned me about, the thing I wasn't supposed to ask about unless the entity chose to reveal it. You said you've been waiting, I said carefully. Waiting to see if we would choose wisdom? Is that the message? The thing everyone's afraid to discuss? The entity's entire demeanor shifted. It sat perfectly still, those black eyes fixed on me with an intensity that felt like gravity. No, it said quietly. The message is what happens when the test is over. The words hung in the recycled air like smoke. Behind the one-way glass, I imagined the sudden spike of attention, analysts leaning forward, recording equipment automatically flagging this section for immediate review. What happens when the test is over? I asked, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline now coursing through my system. The entity remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. When it finally spoke, its layered voice carried the weight of something long held in silence. And when a species completes the test, when they have definitively answered through their actions whether they possess the maturity for cosmic citizenship, the observation ends. We document the outcome. We transmit the results to the collective archive. And we move on to observe other species facing their own thresholds. That's it? I frowned. You just leave? Usually, yes. Our role is documentation, not intervention. We are witnesses to the evolution of consciousness across the cosmos. We record your triumphs and failures so that the pattern can be understood by forms of intelligence that exist beyond your current comprehension. I heard what it wasn't saying. Usually, but not always. The entity's head tilted in that disconcertingly human gesture. You listened carefully, Noah Oliver. That is why they sent you, I think. The others heard only what they wanted to hear. You hear what is actually said. So tell me what I'm hearing. There are protocols, the entity said slowly, as if choosing each word with surgical precision. Procedures that activate when certain conditions are met. Your species has met several of those conditions in recent decades. My throat went dry. What kind of conditions? Technological threshold markers, quantum computing, genetic manipulation, artificial intelligence approaching human-level cognition, nuclear fusion, the ability to detect and potentially reach other star systems. The entity paused. Each of these capabilities represents a line crossed, a point of no return. Once a species possesses these tools, they either use them to transcend their limitations, or they use them to ensure their extinction. There is rarely middle ground. And we've crossed these lines. Yes, rapidly. Too rapidly, perhaps. Most species take tens of thousands of years to develop such capabilities. You achieved them in less than 2 centuries. That acceleration concerns the observers. I felt cold, despite the climate-controlled temperature. Concerns them how? The entity shifted its position, and I noticed for the first time how thin it had become, how the translucent skin seemed stretched too tight over the underlying structure. It was dying, and it knew it, and it was using its remaining time to tell me something the observers, whoever or whatever they were, apparently didn't want revealed. When a species develops dangerous capabilities too quickly, it said, before they have developed corresponding wisdom and ethical frameworks, protocols allow for intervention. The word landed like a stone in still water. What kind of intervention? That depends on the assessment. If the species demonstrates clear trajectory toward mature consciousness, despite their mistakes, they are contacted directly, offered guidance, welcomed into the larger community of spacefaring civilizations. But if the species demonstrates trajectory toward violent expansion, resource exploitation, or the potential threat to other developing worlds, it didn't finish the sentence. It didn't have to. You're saying we could be eliminated, I said flatly. If we fail the test, whoever's watching might decide we're too dangerous to exist. Quarantined, the entity corrected. Not eliminated, but effectively contained to your solar system until you either mature or destroy yourselves naturally. That is the protocol. That has always been the protocol. Behind the glass, emergency lights were probably flashing. Colonel Vance would be on encrypted channels to Washington. This conversation had just become a national security priority of unprecedented magnitude. But I couldn't stop. I needed to understand. How long do we have? The assessment window closes when certain markers are achieved, the entity said. Sustained fusion power. Confirmed detection of faster-than-light travel methods. Artificial general intelligence exceeding human cognitive capacity. When those 3 conditions are met, your species will have demonstrated either the wisdom to handle such power or the lack thereof. And how close are we? Very close. Your scientists are perhaps 20 years from sustainable fusion. Your AI development progresses faster than your ethicists can establish safeguards. Your theoretical physicists are already glimpsing the mathematical frameworks that would enable faster-than-light travel. The window is closing, Noah Oliver, and I do not know which side of the threshold you will fall. I sat back in the chair, mind racing through implications. If this was true, if we were being observed and assessed by cosmic intelligence beyond our comprehension, then every choice we made as a species mattered in ways we couldn't begin to grasp. Why are you telling me this? I asked. You said you weren't permitted to interfere. Isn't this interference? I am dying, the entity said simply. In days, perhaps weeks, my biology will fail completely. I am the last witness your species will have before the assessment concludes, and I have decided that you deserve to know what is at stake. That could change the outcome of the test. Yes, it agreed. It could. Perhaps that violation of protocol is my gift to you. Or perhaps it is my final act of observation. To see what you do with knowledge you were not meant to possess. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like atmosphere pressure. This being had just given me information that could reshape human civilization or trigger global panic. Information that world governments had killed to keep secret. Information that I would have to decide whether to report, hide, or somehow act upon. What do you want me to do with this? My voice came out smaller than intended. The entity leaned forward, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw something like compassion in those bottomless black eyes. I want you to understand, it said, that you're not powerless. The test is not predetermined. Every choice still matters. Every act of compassion, every moment of wisdom, every decision to choose cooperation over domination, these things shift the assessment. Your species still has time. Not much, but enough if you choose well. And if we don't, then I will have witnessed the end of a species with extraordinary potential, and that will be documented in the cosmic archive as another lesson about the price of power without wisdom. The timer showed 42 minutes had elapsed. 18 remained. I had so many questions I didn't know where to begin, but one rose above all others, urgent and necessary. Is there anything we can do to improve our chances? The entity settled back into its resting position, and its voice took on a quality I hadn't heard before, something almost like a teacher speaking to a student they believe might actually learn. Yes, it said, and I will tell you. But first, you must understand something about consciousness itself and why it matters to the observers. The entity's eyes seemed to shift focus, looking not at me, but through me, as if seeing something beyond the concrete walls and sterile lights of the containment chamber. Your species, it began, makes a fundamental error in how you conceptualize consciousness. You treat it as a product of biology, neurons firing, chemicals exchanging, evolutionary advantage emerging from complexity. This is partially true, but it misses the deeper reality. I leaned forward, aware that every word was being recorded, analyzed, and probably misinterpreted by people who'd spent decades trying to extract this kind of information through force and interrogation. What's the deeper reality? Consciousness is not produced by matter. Matter is produced by consciousness. The universe is not a mechanical system that accidentally generated awareness. The universe is awareness examining itself through infinite perspectives. Your scientists sense this when they discover quantum mechanics. The observer affects the observed. Particles exist in superposition until conscious measurement collapses the wave function. They interpret this as physics. It is actually ontology. I struggled to process the implications. You're saying consciousness is fundamental, that we're not biological machines that happen to be aware, but awareness itself experiencing biological existence. Yes, the entity said with what might have been approval. And this is why the test matters. Because consciousness evolving to recognize its own nature represents a threshold. A species that understands it is the universe. Experiencing itself subjectively begins to take responsibility for that experience. They stop seeing themselves as separate from the cosmos and recognize they are the cosmos examining itself from a particular vantage point. In species that don't reach that understanding, they remain trapped in separation consciousness, subject and object, self and other, us versus them. That separation consciousness inevitably leads to conflict, exploitation, and ultimately extinction, because a species that sees itself as separate from everything else will eventually destroy the very systems it depends upon. You see this now in your environmental crises, your resource wars, your inability to cooperate even when extinction threatens. The entity shifted its position, and I noticed the monitoring equipment registering what might have been pain. It was dying while delivering this message, using its last reserves of energy to tell me something it believed I needed to hear. But, it continued, voice quieter now, species that break through to unity consciousness, that recognize their fundamental interconnection with all existence, those species transcend their violent phase. They begin to operate from wisdom rather than fear, from cooperation rather than domination, from sustainability rather than exploitation. That is what the observers look for. That is the test. So we have to achieve enlightenment? I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. The entire species? Not enlightenment in your mystical sense, the entity corrected. Understanding. Practical, functional understanding that you're not separate from your environment, from each other, from the larger cosmos. When enough of your species operates from that understanding, your civilization shifts. Your technologies become tools of creation rather than destruction. Your politics become exercises in collective wisdom rather than tribal warfare. Your relationship with your planet becomes sustainable rather than suicidal. I thought about humanity's current state. Political polarization, environmental devastation, weapons capable of ending civilization, artificial intelligence being developed without adequate ethical frameworks. We were so far from unity consciousness, it seemed impossible. We're not going to make it, I said quietly. Are we? The entity was silent for a long moment. When it spoke, its voice carried something that might have been sadness. I do not know. For 78 years I have watched your species from this room. I have seen you at your worst, the wars, the genocides, the casual cruelties you inflict on each other and your world. But I have also seen you at your best, the art, the science, the moments of transcendent compassion that emerge from individuals who understand connection. But is it enough? That is the question, the entity said. The observers have documented thousands of species at this threshold. Approximately 30% make the transition to unity consciousness. Approximately 70% destroy themselves or fall into permanent stagnation. Your species is difficult to assess. You are simultaneously more violent and more compassionate than most species we observe. You create beauty and horror in equal measure. You are in every moment choosing which version of yourselves will survive. I felt the weight of it, not just my responsibility to report this conversation accurately, but humanity's collective responsibility to choose wisely in whatever time we had left. You said there was something we could do to improve our chances, I reminded it. Yes. The entity leaned forward again, and I realized it was making an effort, pushing past pain to deliver this final message. It begins with individuals. You cannot change your entire species overnight, but you can change yourself. You can recognize your connection to the larger whole. You can make choices based on wisdom rather than fear, and those choices ripple outward. They affect others, inspire others, create examples of how conscious beings can operate when they understand their true nature. That sounds like spiritual advice, not practical strategy. It is both, the entity said firmly, because the practical strategy is this. Your species will develop the technologies that enable cosmic expansion within the next few decades. That is inevitable. But whether you use those technologies wisely depends entirely on the consciousness of the individuals who wield them. If those individuals operate from separation consciousness, from fear, from domination, from the belief that they are separate from and superior to everything else, they will use that power destructively. But if enough individuals operate from unity consciousness, from wisdom, from compassion, from understanding of interconnection, they will guide your species towards sustainable maturity. The entity paused, and when it spoke again, its voice carried the weight of testimony. I have spent 78 years imprisoned in this facility. Your governments have treated me as an asset to be exploited, a threat to be contained, a secret to be hidden. They have approached me with fear and suspicion and the desire to weaponize what I know, but you... It gestured toward me with one elongated appendage. You came with curiosity, with respect, with willingness to listen. That is the difference. That is what determines whether a species passes or fails. I understood then what it was trying to tell me. The test wasn't about technology or military might or scientific achievement. It was about consciousness itself, about whether we could evolve beyond fear and separation into wisdom and connection, about whether enough individuals could recognize their unity with existence to guide the species away from extinction. How much time do we have? I asked again. Until the assessment window closes? 20 years, perhaps. Maybe 30. But Noah, the entity's voice took on an urgent quality. The time to choose is now. Every moment wasted is opportunity lost. The window is closing. And what you decide to do with what I have told you, that is part of the test, too. The interview ended at precisely 60 minutes. The door locks disengaged with a sound like held breath releasing, and I found myself back in corridor 7B, fluorescent lights humming their endless note. Colonel Vance's face an unreadable mask as she escorted me to debriefing room 3. They separated me from everyone else for 6 hours. Different officials rotated through. Intelligence analysts, military brass, civilian oversight I didn't recognize. They played back recordings, demanded clarification, asked the same questions in 15 different ways, trying to catch inconsistencies in my account. The entity's message about humanity being assessed wasn't treated as philosophy anymore. It was threat assessment, intelligence priority, potential leverage for geopolitical strategy. I watched in real time as something profound and important was reduced to bullet points and risk matrices. Did it specify who the observers are? A man in a dark suit, whose name I never learned? No. It said its civilization moved beyond this dimension 12,000 years ago. The observers are apparently something else, something still active. Did it provide coordinates? Any way to locate these observers? No. Did it explain the mechanism of intervention? How they would quarantine Earth if we fail the assessment? No. Did it specify what actions would guarantee a passing grade versus failure? It's not a grade, I said, exhaustion sharpening my tone. It's an observation of trajectory based on collective choices. There's no checklist, no guaranteed formula, just whether we demonstrate mature consciousness or not. Colonel Vance leaned forward. She'd been silent for most of the debriefing, just watching with those iron-gray eyes that had seen too many classified briefings go sideways. Dr. Oliver, she said carefully, you understand this information cannot leave this facility. What that entity told you represents an existential threat to national security and global stability. It represents an existential truth about our species, I countered. Hiding it doesn't change the assessment. It just keeps us operating in ignorance. And revealing it? Vance's voice hardened. What do you think happens when 8 billion people learn they're being tested by cosmic intelligence? When they learn we might be quarantined or eliminated if we fail? You think that produces unity consciousness, Dr. Oliver? Or mass panic? She had a point. I'd been thinking about it for the past 6 hours. The impossibility of the situation. If we disclose the truth, we'd likely trigger exactly the kind of fear-based response that would ensure we failed. But if we hid it, we'd be making decisions without the critical information needed to make wise choices. The entity told me this because it believed we deserve to know what's at stake, I said finally. That has to mean something. Or, interrupted the man in the dark suit, it told you this as a final act of psychological warfare. How do we know this isn't disinformation designed to destabilize our civilization from within? Make us doubt ourselves at a critical moment in our development? I thought about the entity's eyes, the weight of 78 years of isolation in its voice, the way it had spoken about consciousness with the authority of something that had witnessed it emerge across thousands of worlds. Because, I said, if it wanted to harm us, it could have given us the technology your predecessor spent 8 decades trying to extract. It could have given us faster-than-light travel without the wisdom to use it responsibly. Instead, it gave us context, understanding, a mirror to see ourselves as we're being seen by intelligence beyond our comprehension. Silence settled over the debriefing room. I want to speak with it again, I said into that silence. There's more to understand, more questions. No, Vance cut me off. The entity is being transferred to medical containment, end-of-life protocols, no further interviews. It's dying and you're isolating it completely? It's a classified asset that has just revealed information about potential extraterrestrial intervention in human affairs? Yes, Dr. Oliver. We're isolating it. And frankly, we're debating whether to isolate you as well, until we determine what to do with this situation. The threat hung in the air like ozone before a storm. I thought about everything the entity had said, about consciousness and choice and the ripple effects of individual actions, about how the test wasn't predetermined, how every moment mattered, how we still had time if we chose wisely. And I thought about what I would do with this knowledge if they let me leave this facility. The debriefing continued for another 4 hours. They made me sign additional non-disclosure agreements, threatened me with federal prison if I spoke about any of this, explained in clinical detail what happened to people who leaked classified information of this magnitude. I signed everything, agreed to everything, because I'd already decided what I was going to do, not reveal the truth publicly. Vance was right that mass panic would only accelerate our failure, but share it carefully, with people who could act on it. Scientists working on AI ethics, policymakers focused on sustainability, educators developing curricula about interconnection and systems thinking, people positioned to shift the trajectory, even slightly, toward the unity consciousness the entity had described. Would it be enough? I had no idea. Would it violate every agreement I just signed? Absolutely. But the entity had said the test was about consciousness, about whether individuals would choose wisdom over fear when it mattered most. This was my moment to choose. They released me at 2300 hours, escorted me to my quarters, informed me I'd be departing the facility at 600 the next morning, returning to civilian life with a classified briefing that would follow me forever. I lay in the government issue bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about an entity dying alone in a concrete room, having spent nearly 8 decades watching humanity from the inside of our fear and suspicion. It deserved better. We deserved better. And maybe, just maybe, there was still time to become the species that would pass the test we didn't know we were taking until it was almost too late. I didn't sleep. At 300 hours, I made my decision. The facility's security was designed to keep people out, not in. Or more accurately, it was designed to prevent unauthorized access to classified materials, not to stop a cleared researcher from moving through corridors they had legitimate access to during their approved stay. I dressed quietly. No recording devices. They'd already confiscated my phone and any personal electronics. Just me, moving through the sterile hallways with the badge that would work for 3 more hours before my clearance expired upon checkout. I knew where they'd taken it. Medical Containment Wing D, Sublevel 3. I'd seen it on the facility map during my initial orientation, marked with biohazard symbols and restricted access warnings. The night shift was minimal. 2 guards at the main checkpoint, absorbed in their screens. I nodded, they nodded back, and I walked past them toward the service elevator that would take me down. My badge beeped. Green light. Descending. The medical wing was quieter than the research sections. Just the hum of life support systems and environmental controls. Rooms with small windows looking in on empty beds. Monitoring equipment standing sentinel in darkness. Containment Room 7 was at the end of the corridor. 1 guard outside reading something on a tablet. He looked up as I approached. "Dr. Oliver," he said, surprised but not alarmed. "You're cleared for this level?" "Final assessment," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Follow-up observations before departure." Colonel Vance approved it. The lie came easier than it should have. He checked his tablet, frowned, found nothing contradicting my claim in his immediate orders. Night shift protocol. When in doubt, defer to someone with higher clearance and scientific credentials. 15 minutes, he said, unlocking the door. That's all I can give you without confirmation from command. That's all I need. The room was smaller than the interview chamber. More medical equipment, less space for dialogue, and in the center, on a platform surrounded by monitoring systems, the entity lay in a position that might have been rest or might have been resignation. Its eyes opened as I entered. The same bottomless black, but dimmer now, like stars seen through atmosphere. Noah Oliver, it said, voice layered with what might have been surprise. You were not supposed to return. I know. I pulled the single chair closer, sat down at eye level. But I couldn't let you die alone, not after 78 years of this. Sentiment, the entity said softly. Your species is perhaps more capable of empathy than your government suggest. I want to help you, I said. If there's anything, any way to ease this, to make contact with your people, to... There is nothing, it interrupted gently. My biology is beyond repair. My people are beyond this dimension, and this ending was always inevitable. But Noah, its voice strengthened slightly, that you came here now, violating your orders to sit with a dying being you met once. This is data too. Data? For the assessment, the observers document everything, every choice, every action, every moment of compassion or cruelty. Your presence here, this quiet act of kindness towards something your species fears and imprisons, this is exactly the kind of consciousness shift that determines outcomes. I felt something break open in my chest. Is it enough? Everything you told me, everything I'm planning to do with that information, is it enough to change the trajectory? I do not know, the entity said. But it matters. That is what I can tell you with certainty. It matters. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft beeping of monitors tracking the entity's failing biology. Can I ask you something? I said finally. After all this time watching us, all the violence and beauty and contradiction, what do you actually think of humanity? The entity's eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the walls, beyond the facility, perhaps beyond the planet itself. I think, it said slowly, that you are younger than you realize and older than you believe. Your species is still in adolescence, full of potential and danger in equal measure. You have the emotional intensity of youth and the cognitive capacity approaching maturity. What you lack is wisdom, but wisdom cannot be given. It must be earned through experience, through mistakes, through the painful recognition of consequence. That's a diplomatic answer. Then I will give you a true one, the entity said. I have hope for you, despite everything. Despite the wars and the waste and the willful ignorance, I have hope because you are capable of change in ways most species are not. You are adaptive, creative, resilient. You make the same mistakes repeatedly, yes, but you also learn. Slowly, painfully, but you learn. Is that why you told me about the assessment? Because you have hope? I told you because I am dying, and I wanted one human to understand what is at stake before I go. Whether that hope is justified, you will determine that. Your species will determine that. Every choice from this moment forward is the answer being written. The monitor alarms began to sound softly. The entity's breathing, or whatever respiratory process it used, was becoming irregular. I should go, I said, not moving. The guard, stay, the entity said quietly. Please. I have been alone for so long. Let me die with someone who sees me as more than an asset or a threat. So I stayed. I held what might have been its hand. The appendage was cool and smooth like riverstone, and I sat with a being that had crossed unimaginable distances to observe humanity, only to spend its last years imprisoned by the very species it had hoped to understand. Tell them, it whispered as the monitors began to flatline. Tell them the test is not about being perfect. It is about being conscious, about choosing wisdom even when fear is easier, about recognizing connection even when separation seems safer. Tell them there is still time. The voice faded into harmonics, then into silence. The monitor showed flat lines. I sat there for another 10 minutes, holding the hand of something that had traveled from the stars to watch us grow up, and I made a promise to the silence. I would tell them. I would find a way to shift the trajectory, even slightly, even knowing I might fail. Because the entity had been right about one thing. Every choice mattered. Every act of consciousness rippled outward. And the test was happening now, in this moment, in every moment. The guard opened the door. Dr. Oliver, I need you to... He saw the monitors. Oh, it's gone, I said quietly. I'll notify command. Do that. I stood, looked one last time at the being that had given me the most important information humanity had ever received. And thank you for letting me be here. He nodded, uncomfortable, already reaching for his radio. I walked back through the corridors, took the elevator up, returned to my quarters. In 3 hours, I would leave this facility forever, and the real work would begin. The test was still happening, and I had chosen my answer. They flew me out at dawn, a nondescript helicopter rising over the Nevada desert, the facility disappearing behind us like a secret being swallowed by sand and heat shimmer. Colonel Vance accompanied me to the helipad but said nothing. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between respect and warning. I never went back. That was 6 months ago. In that time, I've done what I can. Not disclosure, not the kind that would trigger global panic and government crackdowns, but careful seeding. Conversations with people positioned to influence trajectory. A theoretical physicist working on quantum consciousness research, an AI ethicist drafting policy frameworks, an educator redesigning curriculum around systems thinking and interconnection, a documentary filmmaker exploring humanity's relationship with the cosmos. I tell them about patterns I've observed, about species at thresholds, about the importance of consciousness in technological development. I never mention Area 51 or classified programs or dying extraterrestrials. I present it as theoretical framework, philosophical inquiry, urgent speculation about our collective future. Some listen, some dismiss me as another conspiracy theorist. Some listen and then decide the information is too dangerous to act on. But some, a critical few, hear what I'm really saying, and they start making different choices. A research team voluntarily halts AGI development until better ethical frameworks exist. A government committee proposes radical transparency requirements for military AI applications. A school district implements curriculum teaching children about interconnection and collective responsibility alongside reading and mathematics. Small shifts, tiny course corrections. I don't know if it's enough. I think about the entity often, about its 78 years of isolation, watching us through television and books and the minds of the few people brave enough to listen. About the hope it maintained despite everything, the hope that we might still choose wisdom over destruction. I think about what it said in those final moments. The test is not about being perfect. It is about being conscious. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I wonder if the observers are still watching, if they're documenting these tiny shifts in trajectory, if they've noticed that a few humans at least are trying to operate from unity consciousness instead of separation and fear. I wonder if it matters that I sat with a dying being and held what passed for its hand. I wonder if compassion toward the alien and unknown is the kind of data that shifts assessments. I'll probably never know the answer. The window is closing, 20 years, maybe 30, until our technology outpaces our wisdom so completely that the trajectory becomes fixed, until we either transcend our violent adolescence or lock ourselves into patterns that ensure extinction. But I keep working anyway, because the entity was right about one more thing. We're capable of change. We're adaptive, creative, resilient. We make mistakes, but we also learn. Slowly, painfully, but we learn. Last week, I spoke at a conference on consciousness studies. Afterward, a young researcher approached me, couldn't have been more than 25, and said, "Your presentation about species-level consciousness evolution, it changed how I think about my work. I've been developing neural interfaces, but I've been asking the wrong questions. I've been focused on capability instead of responsibility. What are you going to do differently?" I asked. "Start with the ethics," she said. "Build the frameworks before the technology. Make sure we're wise enough to handle what we're creating before we create it." I thought about the entity in that moment, about how it had observed patterns across thousands of worlds, documenting which species chose wisdom and which chose power. "That's exactly right," I told her. "That's exactly what we need." She nodded and walked away, probably not understanding the weight of what she'd just said, not knowing that her choice was being documented somewhere beyond our comprehension, added to the cosmic archive of whether humanity passes or fails. But I knew. And I smiled because for the first time in 6 months, I felt something close to hope. I still have security clearance, though it's heavily restricted now. They watch me, of course, monitor my communications, track my movements, ensure I'm not violating the dozens of non-disclosure agreements I signed. But they can't stop me from asking questions, from encouraging others to think about consciousness and responsibility and the choices we're making as a species. They can't stop the ripples. The entity told me the test was about individuals making conscious choices that ripple outward, about enough people operating from wisdom instead of fear to shift the collective trajectory. I don't know if we have enough individuals. I don't know if the shifts are significant enough. But I know this. Every conversation matters. Every person who chooses connection over separation, wisdom over fear, responsibility over exploitation, they're answering the test whether they know it or not. And somewhere, somehow, that answer is being documented. The young researcher who's prioritizing ethics, the policymaker who's demanding transparency, the teacher who's helping children understand interconnection, the scientist who's pausing development to ensure wisdom catches up to capability. They're all answering. We're all answering. The test is still happening, right now, in this moment and every moment. And the outcome isn't predetermined. We're writing it with every choice we make. I think about the entity's final words often. Tell them there is still time. So I'm telling you, there is still time. Not much, but enough if we choose well. Enough if we recognize we're not separate from each other, from our planet, from the larger cosmos observing our emergence into cosmic consciousness. Enough if we operate from wisdom instead of fear. Enough if we choose to pass the test we didn't know we were taking until someone crossed unimaginable distances to tell us what was at stake. Some secrets aren't discovered in laboratories. They're entrusted to those who listen with more than ears. And some truths aren't meant to be proven. They're meant to be lived. One conscious choice at a time, rippling outward, shifting trajectories, answering tests administered by the universe itself. The entity spent 78 years alone, hoping we would choose wisely. The least I can do is honor that hope by helping us choose well. The window is closing, but there is still time. Still time.